Hi, welcome to Adoption Now, your adoption show. I'm April Fallon. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to Adoption Now, your adoption show. I'm your host, April Fallon. We're so honored that so many of you have written us your stories. Adoption is a wonderful yet vulnerable journey, and I learn new things from every interview. Or if I have a question concerning my 4 children, often it gets answered on this show by a guest. I'm so thankful for this community, and I'm thankful for you. Those of you who have joined Adoption Now Warriors and praying for the needs of others. If you'd like to get involved, you can look for the group on Facebook. Okay, we're going to jump right into our story today. We have Jillian Goble, who is a speaker, author, and advocate for adoption. Her and her husband, Luke, are parents to 5 children, and she has written 2 books, one called No Sugarcoating, and the other is A Love Stretched Life. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, April. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, I just want to start off by saying I love No Sugarcoating.
Really? Oh, thank you for saying that.
It really is such a straightforward book on very practical things that you would need to know when you're fostering. Things like don't change their food right away. I mean, I thought that was just so simple, and yet a lot of us don't think of that, right? So you would have them eating what your family eats. So I love that you said, like, go easy on the broccoli. Right. Don't like force the new child in your life to eat exactly the way you eat. A lot of times, like you said, they've been eating differently, maybe not the healthiest. And so switching their food right away could be a huge shock. I mean, little things like that in this book are super, super helpful.
Thank you so much. And, I think though, the title says, the coffee talk you need for foster parenting. I've had a lot of adoptive parents say, oh, this totally applies to us as well. So don't let the title scare you. Just in terms of fostering, I think it's applicable to the adoption community as well. But I do talk a lot about the transitions of going in and out, which of course would not be applicable to adoption, but more foster parenting. But both of my kids came to me via the foster care system. And so that is why I wrote this little book. And honestly, April, it's what I wish somebody had sat me down and straight talked and just said, hey, here's some of the ways that this journey is going to change you in practical ways, and is also going to change your lens on the world.
Mm-hmm. I like that you also said that if you like a linear story, which I like, that fostering might disrupt that way of living, that it goes all over the place. You really never know where you're going. And you talk about that in your other book also, A Love Stretched Life. You talk about how things were not as you had planned. Let's talk about your first journey in adoption.
Well, I would love to. Our first fostering journey was with a young little guy named Royal. He was our very first. We were the ripe old age of 25. We had exactly 0 parenting experience, April. So, as it goes, it's well, if you have a pulse and no criminal record, you can be a caregiver for this child. And we stepped forward, and it completely changed our lives. We very quickly realized, oh my gosh, we are in way over our heads. There is a vast difference between taking nice, neat notes in a journal and then living out the reality before us. And so that was our first parenting experience with Royal. We were disconnected for 13 years. Long story short, we reconnected with him 5 years ago when he was a 19-year-old young man. We had not seen him since he was 7 years old. And, it's been quite a story of really, we always talk about seeds planted. There's all these metaphors about that. But I feel in my life, the story of reconnecting with Royal has really affirmed that to not just be a Disney version of something nice to say when times are hard, right? It really was oh my gosh, here's this young man who's now 24, and he's telling me about, the Spider-Man poster in his room and the lunchbox he took to first grade. And remember when we went ice skating into Chuck E. Cheese. And so, I think memories for anyone impacted by trauma can be really fuzzy sometimes, but there can also be this crystal clear clarity. And it's been mind-boggling for me to see both of those things in his life now. So he's not legally attached to us, but I call him the son of my heart, and he calls me mom, and we talk quite a bit and are in touch. And really, honestly, April, have like kind of intentionally chosen one another. I mean, Royal did not have a choice when he was 6 years old, placed in foster care in my home, but he certainly had a choice as a 19-year-old young man, like who he was going to be connected with and how often. And so it has just been a wild and woolly journey, but it's been a huge privilege for me to be able to like stand alongside him through some really hard things. I mean, this young man has lived every dismal statistical outcome of what happens when kids bounce around in an overwhelmed and dysfunctional system without permanency. And so, you know, in his specific case, this looked like getting into trouble and going into youth authority and then getting into trouble there and being charged as an adult and then, you know, being released to nothing, to the streets, and all the things, you know, that come with just kids who kind of have the system fail them, honestly. And so that has been a huge eye opener for me. I love how we can just continue to learn about like things in theory and then like things in technicolor real life. And I feel like Royal has brought to life all of the hurdles and the obstacles we hear about young people aging out of foster care. And it's just made it that much more real for me.
I love that. I think that your story is so timely. And like I said, I love the show because whenever I have a question, either from another family or myself, then somebody like you comes around and answers those questions or gives us some hope about a story. We have really close friends who have tried to adopt 4 children. It's been a 2-year journey, and just recently they were reunited back with their family, and that was not supposed to happen. The biological connection had been broken and they were supposed to be adoptable. So the family is just devastated, right? They want to support the family, but it's just not a good situation, the biological family. So they have been grieving, and I came in, I just love them so much. I'm like, guys, you planted these seeds. You changed these kids' lives. You really, really did. And it just felt like my words fell to the ground, right? It was not, like you said, just those sympathy words. I was hoping that they would be more powerful. And then I pre-interviewed you, and you come on and you're like, listen, it boomeranged back around, right? And now we have this relationship. Those seeds were planted. That is true. Even though it seems cliche, it's true.
Exactly. It's really true. And I think it's so hard, right? Because it's so rare when someone's able to articulate back to us, or when we're able to realize, standing in that moment, standing in that grief or heartache or anger, whatever, you know, emotions, pouring your lives into, you know, kids for years and years, and then kind of having them disappear without continued contact. It's like super tough. So I think it's like rare to have that clarity in the moment, but I'm telling you, I feel really, I feel like saying, I feel so blessed is like almost a cliche, but honestly, April, I feel like if there's a part of me that wonders if Royal had like been adopted by us and raised in our home, like that's kind of a haunting question mark, right? Like, would his life taken all of these detours? Like, would we have been able to kind of sidestep some of these painful things? Maybe, but also maybe not. And, you know, these are just kind of these unanswerable questions of life, but we have such a good, close relationship today that despite the pain of not having the privilege of watching him grow up, you know, I sometimes wonder, like, would we be as close today, you know, if this hadn't been our journey? And I think part of the strength there has been in his choice, right? And his choice to want a mom and a dad, and to want somebody to be called Nana and Papa for his kids, and to have somebody to call when he's filling out job applications, and just all the things, all the practical things, and then all the emotional things, right?
And that he knows you still love him. that kids come into your
100%.
home and then leave in the foster care system, but they always know we still love you. We still think of you. We still pray for you. So I love that part of your story. But let's move forward to when you start adopting.
Totally. So a few years later, we welcomed a 6-month-old baby boy into our lives named Micah. And I had never had the opportunity to meet a child welfare involved parent before, but I met Micah's mom, first mom, Jennifer, at court. And at that time, the plan was, strongly reunification. This was her 3rd child. Jennifer grew up in foster care. Her other kids have been child welfare involved. But what was so interesting, April, is that all I heard was that she was kind of named by her struggle. I didn't know her as a person. I kind of just knew the peripheral details as to why this child was in foster care. But at court, I kind of walked up to her and just said, "Hey, I'm Jelana and I'm fostering your son. And when he is reunited with you, I want your bond to be strong. And I have this for you." And I just held out a photograph and she burst into tears. And I found myself very unexpectedly giving her a hug and saying, "I just want to let you know I'm rooting for you." And honestly, those words, "I'm rooting for you," kind of became like the driving force for our relationship. And that was 13 years ago. There have been so many ups and downs. In fact, we have the privilege of sharing our story for 90 minutes every month with brand new state caseworkers, just trying to give them a picture of what it can look like when a foster turned adoptive mom and a biological mom work in collaboration. To make a very long story short, after doing, 150 hours of supervised visits, which really honestly put me in counseling because I just was walking this jagged tightrope, it felt like, of oh my gosh, what does it look like to walk this road well and with integrity and to love this child with every fiber of my being, and also to begin to care deeply for his mother and begin to understand some of her stories and listen to some of what she's been through and really begin to feel gosh, if I had lived her life, there is a darn good chance I might be standing where she's now standing today. So what would I want for somebody to do, or how to engage with me?
It's so powerful.
We ended up adopting her child, and then we ended up fostering and then returning twice her 4th child, which was the full biological brother of the 3rd child who we adopted. So it's been an interesting journey, April, because we started out as general foster parents, right? I didn't know her. I just showed up at court and I introduced myself, and that was the beginning of our relationship. But then once we had adopted her 3rd child, when she, when the full biological brother of Micah came into care, that was when it was okay, the state of Oregon was shoulder tapping us saying, now you're a relative and this child needs a foster placement, and can you be it? And so we have had a lot of emotions that we felt with and toward one another throughout the years. And honestly, I'm really proud to say that, she's one of the most cherished and most influential people in my life. I adore her. And it has been a really challenging road. I feel like we've basically been building this bridge to one another where we didn't have a blueprint. And so it's kind of wonky in some places. And in some places, entire planks are missing, where we've had to kind of trust one another, even when it's been hard. But we're 13 years into this relationship. And so it's taken me into adopting one of her children after he was in foster care for 2 years, and then fostering and returning an infant to her back to her treatment facility. And then 4 years later, when she relapsed, fostering him and returning him 9 months later. And that was 6 years ago. She's been clean and sober for 6 years. And I'm super proud of her for that. And she's a darn good mom, honestly, when she's clean and sober. And she and her other 3 kids come over to our house quite a bit. We are not co-parenting. I want to make that very clear. But we have an openness with her and her other kids that just feels natural. In fact, Jennifer and I were speaking to caseworkers last week, and the question we always get is well, how did the 2 boys do together? And I thought Jennifer gave a brilliant answer when she said, you know what, they're kind of like more like cousins. Like that's kind of the way that they treat and interact with one another. It's like, yeah, I mean, they can have fun together. They can kind of annoy each other. They're excited to see each other. Sometimes they need space. I mean, just all that kind of like sibling slash cousin stuff. But I think that was a perfect description. They're kind of engaged like cousins. And it's never been something that Micah has not been aware of, right? So like at developmental kind of age appropriate stages along the way, we've been able to like fill in more blanks about who Jennifer is and why he was in foster care and why he was adopted and why he has, a brother and sister that live in a different home and a brother that lives with Jennifer and he lives here. And, it's a lot for a child to take in, but we've tried to just kind of gently ease him into all these dynamics, but there's never been like a big reveal, if you will. He's always known who Jennifer was.
We are going to bring Jennifer on next show so we can ask her lots of questions because she has 2 other children. Did she have them at the time? And then what's the child's name that came back and forth? Elias. Okay.
Uh-huh.
I wonder how Elias feels going back and forth. Like, did he ever say, I just want to stay in one home?
It's interesting. Well, first of all, one of the things that struck me is that it is obviously, for the sake of stating the obvious, vastly different to foster an infant than it is to foster a preschooler who can like ask you point blank, Auntie, where's my mom? Right? Like it's very different when you're fostering a tiny little baby that isn't expressing an opinion. Yeah, I mean, I think for a while, what was sad for me was, well, first of all, Jennifer and I had to get our relationship back on track. I just felt really upset and kind of betrayed it felt a slap in the face, like the way that Elias entered foster care. But, we sat down and we talked it through and there were a lot of tears and, it was like this, hey, we want our family to get back on track, but it's not like we just name it and claim it and just say like, okay, we're good. And we go back. Like it's going to take years to rebuild that trust that we had been slowly building up over years. And she got that. And I'm totally happy to say like we have now surpassed that point where I feel like the trust is and is higher than ever. But initially, to answer your question, April, Elias did have a hard time coming back to our house because now instead of this being Auntie and Papa's house where it's like the fun house, the place where he got to go on weekends and kind of engage with Micah and the other kids here and bounce on the trampoline, now our house represented trauma. Like this is the place I stayed when my mom disappeared and didn't come back for me. And so for a while, he would walk in the door of our house once he was back at Jennifer's and we would offer to, pick him up for a play date or what have you. He would come over and he would walk in and then he would immediately want to turn around and go back home just to make sure that his mom was there. And that's fine, more than understandable. We didn't try to convince him otherwise, but after kind of giving him that space, I'd say 6 months to a year into it, he felt comfortable after being reunited with Jennifer. He felt comfortable coming and hanging out. And now he's at the point where he's like, Auntie, can I spend the night? He likes to be here and we love having him. So thankfully that's fallen by the wayside, but we don't just turn it on and off, right? Like we were a safe place for him. And then something traumatic happened in his life and we were the ones trying to hold the pieces together for him. And unfortunately, our house now represented abandonment and trauma, right? And so that wasn't going to just change overnight, but I'm really grateful that after a long time of just being steadfast and trying to be real chill about what he needed, we are back on track.
It's interesting when you say that you were not co-parenting. It's more like a partnership. Would you say that?
I would say that. Yeah, I would say that. I mean, essentially, Jennifer and I live in the same city and we're raising full biological brothers 20 minutes across town from one another. I mean, it's almost like the ultimate nature versus nurture experiment, right? Like our households are different and kind of the way we run things are different, but we're able to connect with one another. We're able to kind of compare notes because the boys, despite, differences in environment and being raised, do have quite a few similarities. And so, I'm happy to share pictures and invite her to his baseball games and, talk about this, that, and the other with her. And that's, I want to be clear that wasn't like we met and all of a sudden we're super close. Like we're talking about like, this is year like 7 or 8 in our relationship, right? When, when Elias was, returned, and we've had, all these ups and downs. It's not, I don't want to communicate that it's been this like rainbow and roses journey. I mean, there have certainly been moments where I feel like the joy has been multiplied just because it's been so hard to get to where we have been, to find sure, footing on that kind of relational bridge to one another. But it has been pretty hard. And like I said, she's been really frustrated and mad at me at times, and same with her.
Mm-hmm. I think it's different when you have an addiction involved, right? With our birth families, there is that as well. So it's not as linear as I'd like it to be. We love them deeply and have relationship with them, but sometimes it's in and out, and sometimes it looks really messy because we don't know where they are in their journey. Are they clean? Are they just coming off of something? And so that can make it really difficult. But I want to say I'm just so proud of you for staying in it and really committing to your child's birth parent. I mean, that is a commitment to stay in a relationship. And because of that, you're being blessed. Because of that, all these things are coming out of it. And we get to learn from your relationship. And so the next show is going to be so good because we're going to bring her on and we're going to talk about everything a little bit more in detail. You do talk about it in your book as well.
I do talk about it. And I also want to just say, I mean, there were times for my own emotional boundaries, April, like you said, addiction is a game changer, right? As you're engaging with someone. And so there were times for my own emotional boundaries where I had to say, you know what, I'm not supervising visits anymore because this feels too heavy, or I feel too heartbroken when you're a no-show. Like I need to pull in, extra supports and kind of lean on the agency, so to speak. So there were a lot of ups and downs, but even in the down times, even in the times where we weren't as connected, I still feel like there was a foundation of her knowing that we genuinely cared about her, which is what allowed us to kind of circle back around to one another in the times where we kind of had some dips and valleys in our relationship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you went on to adopt again.
Yeah, again. Oh gosh, this is my sweet little Charlie Fred. I feel like so many people have these stories, right, of getting a call from the foster agency and asking if you can, take in a child for this very short amount of time. For us, it was, can you pick up this baby from the hospital and foster him for the weekend? April, I barely talked to my husband, Luke, about it because I was like, hey, 48 hours, like you can do anything for 48 hours. Well, that is now, to my delight, my 10-and-a-half-year-old son named Charlie. And when Charlie was, we didn't know very much about Charlie's biological parents. It was not at all the same story that I've walked with Jennifer. His birth mom was out of the picture when he was just 5 weeks old, and we didn't know who dad was. So, we're kind of like holding this mystery, and we were so pleased to be able to adopt him. He has a very loving biological grandparent out of state that has remained in touch with us, and we're super, super thankful for her presence in his life and in our lives. She's kind of, she sends all 4 of my kids, like $1 for Valentine's Day or like a birthday card. I just really, really appreciate her. But when he was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. We had begun to notice, after his adoption finalized when he was around 2, we had begun to notice some just kind of general delays. And, it's always tricky, right? When those delays kind of fall right on the edge between like typically developing and delayed. And we just were realizing like, okay, he's super late to get his teeth. He's super late to walk. He's super late to talk. He is crying all the time. He never sleeps more than 2 to 3 hours. And, looking back, now I can see so many signs. But I think at that point, it was just kind of a like, well, give it some time. Like, let's just see what's happening here. So the diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome is pretty daunting. And he is pretty severely impacted, and we love him dearly. And our life is on a different parenting track for sure. I think parenting trauma is one thing, and then parenting a child who has some significant in utero substance abuse, specifically alcohol, is quite another. And so it has definitely put our family on a path to being able to see kids that have these invisible brain-based disabilities. And it's super tough, April, because they honestly, on the outside, just look like they are non-compliant and like willfully disobedient and super, like it can look all sorts of very unattractive ways, but really it's a brain-based disability. This is something that's irreparable, and he will have it forever. And so our privilege and our daily challenge is to try to accommodate him and to make the environment, as smooth as possible.
And how did the school handle your child?
I wish I could say like they handle him beautifully. Like we've had this, I have to say, we had an amazing relationship with his kindergarten through second grade teacher. He was in a blended classroom. She was like a unicorn, and we just adored her and had such a good relationship. And I think it's rare for teachers to have both a strong, like very strong structure and very high nurture, which is what he was needing. But unfortunately, as his behaviors got more severe, he was excused from that school and put in a new school where, unfortunately, like it seemed like the only tool in their toolbox was to use like physical restraint. And it's been a whole thing, and we're still kind of in the midst of it. But long story short, April, his behaviors, he was so dysregulated at school. There was A, no learning going on, and B, it was not an emotionally safe place for him to be. So we are now homeschooling him. I'm not sure how long this will be, but it was enough for, my husband Luke to find a different job so that he could be home more and we could switch off mornings. And then we have a developmental disability aide who we cherish and are so grateful for, who has worked with our family for 3 years and knows Charlie better than anyone, and hangs out with him after we do our homeschool mornings. So,
and how did you find that person?
So fetal alcohol syndrome, like autism, are one of the two invisible disabilities, brain-based disabilities that qualify for the state's developmental disability services. And so, there can be contracted agencies that can work with families. We were really fortunate that, my husband used to be a university professor and was able to shoulder tap a really great student of his who got married, and it's basically the husband of the student that kind of that took over. So that's how we found them. People can find their developmental disability aides a number of different ways, but we feel super fortunate because we recognize it is pretty rare for somebody to have that kind of longevity in a caretaking role. And so we're super grateful, but that's how we found him.
What would you say to a family who's looking into that right now? And they're just like, where do I start?
I think I would say, for families to, if there's some big behaviors going on with your kids, I think there's really a tendency to kind of think about trauma. And that is very, very, very real. We know that the effects of trauma are unquantifiable. And I think oftentimes we may not know the full history. And I think it's fair to also look at, in utero alcohol exposure for some of those behaviors. Because I think if we look at I don't want to quote a statistic that's not 100% accurate, but it is exponential, the number of kids that are affected with FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that are in foster care or adoption. It is astronomically more than in just the general population. And it's not something that's really talked about. I think oftentimes in training sessions, it's really insufficient. There's kind of this quick, like drugs and alcohol lumped together, but families don't really lead knowing the behavioral signs of what that can look like. So often we attribute those behavioral signs to trauma. And while that could very well be true, it can also be true that there could be some, substance in utero substance exposure issues that are also coming into play.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is something that you suspect may be your child, I cannot recommend enough Diane Malbin's book, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder. It's just a short little primer. And that was the book that I read, April, that was like, here it is. I mean, Charlie was racking up diagnosis after diagnosis after diagnosis. And if you looked at the diagnosis, it was like, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see that. But we were missing, it was like we were interlocking these puzzle pieces of diagnoses, but we were like missing the picture of like, what's the landscape? What's the ultimate like picture here of like what we're putting together as we're snapping all these puzzle pieces together. And it wasn't until I read that book, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder, that it kind of clicked into vision for me. And I just thought, this is what Charlie has. And so I would really encourage families to not be timid, but to go to your primary care physician, to seek out a developmental pediatrician, and to, come with like this is, these are the signs, and this is how my child exhibits these signs. So almost, in the most respectful way, prove to me he doesn't have this. And
right.
If I had waited for somebody to give me a diagnosis, I would still be waiting.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful that I just kind of took the initiative, because as you know, like this is a road that has a lot of confusing things as we as parents do our best to try to help our kids. And we just don't want to miss that sign.
It's like unlocking the mystery, right? And, I believe in being an advocate for your child as well. And I do know what it's like to have a doctor say, well, we think it's this or we think it's that. But some of the signs you told me are not sleeping at night, head measures small, writing is hard, hearing is hard, and they have a hard time in school. I think getting the school behind you is really important. That's what we needed, is the school to say, this is what we're seeing. And then we said, this is what we're seeing at home. And then you're working with a doctor that cares and that you trust, and coming to a place where you can find a true diagnosis. And so I'm glad that you continue to do that. We talked a little bit in our pre-interview about adoption and how adoption wrecks your life, but also saves it. And I want to just talk really quick about your book. Let's talk about A Love Stretched Life.
So A Love Stretched Life is honestly the kind of, if you could look at no sugarcoating as like this short, like little bullet point manual, right? Of like, here's some things you need to know. A Love Stretched Life is really kind of the narrative version of how those things have played out in my life. It really follows the narrative of fostering Royal and then reconnecting with him as a young adult. It explores, the 13 years that Jennifer and I have been walking alongside one another as I've adopted one of her children and fostered another. And it explores the joy and the grief and really rumbling with that on this road less traveled with our youngest, who has fetal alcohol. So there's a lot of other stuff in the book. I don't want to just say it's like those three stories, but those are kind of the three main narratives. But I just talk about, friendship and what it means to kind of survive versus thrive. And what does it look like to try to look for support and try to like keep ourselves afloat so that we're not drowning as we're trying to uplift others in our family. So the book, A Love Stretched Life, explores all of that. And honestly, April, it is not a book where it's like, hey, I have overcome these difficulties, so here's my 5 tips to like live your best life with your, foster adopted child. It is very much like, hey, I'm standing in the trenches and I want people to feel more seen and less alone. And that's really what, that was the driving force of being able to write A Love Stretched Life.
Thank you so much for being on the show. We are going to bring on Jennifer next show. So you're going to be with us next week as well. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, April. It was so great to talk with you.
And thank you for listening. If you have an adoption story you'd like to share, please email us at afallon@adoptionnowpodcast.com. We would love for you to subscribe to our weekly podcast and follow us on social media. Thanks for joining us on Your Adoption Show. See you next episode.